The whole enterprise is crazy, and it's an absolute scam which is going to cost you a great deal.
It's rather like paying monkeys, because what happens is the civil servants draw up the list, and if it's vote number 58 and the piece of paper says vote yes, you vote yes, and if it's number 59 and it says vote no, you vote no. It is an absolute farce. It is a complete sham masquerading as democracy.
You should not be mistaken. It's very, very strong forces are working towards this federal state.
If you're British, this film is about you, every one of you. Something is happening in Britain which increasingly intrudes into the way you live. Traditional customs, familiar and trusted patterns of a liberal, compassionate society, the British way of doing things, all are disappearing and being replaced by a frustrating avalanche of alien regulation and bureaucracy. This is happening not as such a popular demand, but as a result of British membership of the European Union. The very character of our unique way of life is being destroyed, and there has been no public debate, consultation, or approval. Almost all you're about to hear has been hidden from you. Everything you're about to hear is the truth.
For the last 34 years, British politicians have been hiding from you the fact that they've been handing over the governance of your country to Brussels. This film shows how close they are to completing that process. In 1972, the British people were told that they were joining something called the Common Market. They were assured by Prime Minister Edward Heath that this was just a trading arrangement and involved no loss of essential national sovereignty. In this, the British nation was seriously and deliberately deceived. Today, as a result of that 1972 arrangement, British national identity, a British government and British independence are about to be sacrificed. Britain is to disappear within a European federal state, and the British people are to be governed from Brussels by unelected foreign officials. A succession of British politicians have continued that 1972 deceit and secretly stripped Britain of self-government. Details of this whole process have been suppressed and kept from you. Most people in Britain haven't a clue as to what is happening. Christopher Booker explains why.
One of the most remarkable things about the European Union is how ignorant people are as to how it came about. A few years ago, when my colleague Richard North and I began researching the history of what is called the European project, we were astonished to find just how distorted and inaccurate all previous accounts of this story had been. The core ideas which have inspired this project go back to the 1920s, and for the men behind it, notably the Frenchman Jean Monnet, their ultimate goal right from the start was to create a United States of Europe. Their aim was to place the peoples of Europe under a form of government like nothing the world had seen before, a government that was supranational. To achieve their goal, they came up with two brilliantly clever ideas. The first was that it could never be achieved overnight. It would have to be assembled piece by piece over many years without revealing its ultimate purpose. The other idea was that all the national governments of Europe should be left in place, while being gradually hollowed out from within, as they passed under ever greater control by the supranational power. Thus, what amounted to a slow-motion coup d'etat could take place without people realizing what was happening. That is why we called our story The Great Deception, because such is what the historical evidence shows it to have been. Step one in the early 1950s was Monnet's European Coal and Steel Community. He never intended this body to be anything other than the embryo of what would eventually be a government for Europe. The next step was to widen this into a European Economic Community set up by the Treaty of Rome in 1957. Again, this common market was deliberately intended to be just a cover for their true goal of complete political union. For nearly 30 years, the handing over of powers by national governments continued, the original 6 countries becoming 12, until in the 1980s the project was ready for its next great leap forward. This would need 2 new treaties, the Single European Act in 1986 and the Maastricht Treaty on European Union in 1992, followed in 1997 and 2001 by 2 more at Amsterdam and Nice. By now the real aims were coming out ever more into the open, as it was agreed that this new supranational government should have its own currency, its own foreign and defence policies, its own court system and police force, all the attributes of a sovereign state. Finally, as the number of member countries rose to 25, it was agreed that as the next great symbolic act in the story, Europe must have its own constitution. In 2005, as we know, this was rejected by the voters of France and Holland. But by now, the project is so far advanced that those behind it believe it must roll on regardless. As we finally wake up to their real aim, how much longer can the wishes of the people of Europe be ignored? Such is the battle in which today, whether we like it or not, we are all involved.
The EU constitution Christopher Booker referred to is a major step in the final transfer of power from Westminster to Brussels. But it's more than that. It will mean imposing on the British people a continental view of freedom where nothing is allowed unless the law says so. In Britain, we are free-born from the moment of our birth, able to do anything unless the law prohibits. In the European Union, we are about to lose that. Britain already has a constitution of its own, one that has stood the test of time and been admired and copied by other countries, in particular America, whose founding fathers used the British model when drafting their own constitution.
This is the village of Goudhurst. It's been said that if Kent is the Garden of England, then Goudhurst is the Garden of Kent. The English way of life has gone on here for centuries. But is all that about to become a thing of the past? In 1996, chairman of the British Referendum Party, Sir James Goldsmith, circulated copies of a short film documentary to millions of households across the country. Frustrated by the lack of mainstream press coverage over what he saw as the dismantling of British sovereignty and independence by colluding politicians, Sir James's wake-up call to the people of Great Britain was stark and shocked many.
What you're about to hear will both surprise and outrage you. It's the true story of Europe. It's the story the politicians don't want you to hear, because it shows how they've deceived us and betrayed our nation. Only in 1994 did Chancellor Kohl's foreign policy spokesman, speaking on behalf of the ruling party of Europe's dominant nation, Germany, clearly reveal the true plan. The plan is to create a federal European superstate. Into it will be merged up to 25 ancient European nations, including our own. This new country, called Europe, will have one parliament, one government, one court of justice, one currency, one flag, and one anthem. That has been the plan all along. But those who favoured it knew that people of Europe would never accept it. They would never willingly surrender their freedoms to become just a province in a vast European superstate. So what did the politicians do? They conspired to keep the truth from the people.
So what is the truth behind the European Union? Is it, as our politicians keep telling us, Britain's best hope for the future? A chance to regain some of that lost prestige on the world stage by being at the centre of Europe? Today in Britain, all three major political parties miraculously appear to agree at least on one thing. They believe in the destruction of Great Britain as an independent nation. They believe an integrated Europe makes sense, that it is the modern, forward-thinking way to go, that it would prevent any chance of a third European war. Unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth.
The need to unite Europe grew understandably out of the devastation left behind after two catastrophic world wars. Of all the empires, it was perhaps the Nazis who came closest to pulling off the military conquest and occupation of Europe in recent times. In June 1940, Hermann Göring, Reich Marshal of the German Luftwaffe, reviews final plans for Operation Sea Lion, the German invasion of Great Britain. He also discusses with Hitler a new plan to unite Europe, not just under the conquering hammer of Blitzkrieg, but through a lasting political and economic union, which the Nazis named Europäische Wirtschaftsgemeinschaft, or the European Economic Community. In 1942, a conference is held in Berlin to discuss this political and economic integration of Europe. Of all the nations targeted, Britain has proved the wild card because she alone has successfully resisted invasion. Rising to his feet at the conference, Nazi economist Professor Horst Jecht of Berlin University firmly declares that Britain is the greatest obstacle to Germany fulfilling her historic aim of dominating Europe.
Winston Churchill also believed Britain had an incompatible destiny with that of the continent. Referring to the United Kingdom's reliance on her overseas trade, Churchill stated, "If Britain must choose between Europe and the open sea, we will choose the sea." Both Churchill and Jecht were independently remarking on the same phenomenon Napoleon had noticed 150 years before, that Great Britain was a global trading power, and the nations of Europe weren't.
According to the Nazis, Great Britain's awesome maritime capability was beggaring Europe because it was drawing trade away from the continent. If Britain could be conquered militarily or economically, broken up once and for all as a significant economic and political entity, the spoils of all her trade and wealth would go to whoever ran the new European empire. Few in Berlin were in any doubt about who would do the running. But the tide of war turned against Germany. In 1944, a meeting was held at the Hotel Rothers House in Strasbourg between officials of the Nazi government and German industrialists. The theme of the meeting was, how will Germany dominate the peace when she loses the war?
Following the end of World War II, the rebuilding of Europe, and Germany in particular, became a pressing necessity and was largely funded under the Marshall Plan by the United States. Both Washington and London saw the rapid stabilization of the continent after the war as essential in order to prevent any incursion into Western Europe by the new enemy to be feared, the Soviet Union.
Winston Churchill agreed that some form of Commonwealth of Nations in Europe was desirable for establishing stability and a lasting peace. But he never envisioned Britain as being part of any future United States of Europe.
Winston Churchill's view of Great Britain's relationship with Europe after the Second World War is summarized with these words of his. But we have our own dream and our own task. We are with Europe, but not of it. We are linked but not comprised. We are interested and associated but not absorbed.
The Allied answer to military stability in Europe was to be the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which came into existence in 1949 as a permanent defense alliance for Europe. The European Union officially began life as the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, a modest industrial cooperation between France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg and Holland. 6 years later, in 1957, the Treaty of Rome was signed by the 6 participating coal and steel community nations. Declaring its goal as the ever closer union of the peoples of Europe, the Treaty of Rome went far beyond launching just a common market. It established the fledgling apparatus for an idealistic new superpower. This new entity was given an existing and unsettlingly familiar name: the European Economic Community. In 1963, Charles de Gaulle and Konrad Adenauer signed the Treaty of Élysée, signifying the symbolic burying of the hatchet between France and Germany. This was the start of a dynamic new dual leadership role in Europe for the two countries. De Gaulle later resigned, and within a year was dead. Britain was invited to submit yet another application to join the EEC. This time, Edward Heath, now as Britain's Conservative Prime Minister, signed the Treaty of Rome and took Britain into the common market on New Year's Day, 1973. Responding to deep concerns within his own country that joining the EEC would compromise Britain's national sovereignty and independence, Heath sought to reassure the British people in a government white paper. He wrote, "There is no question of Britain losing essential national sovereignty." The master plan, of course, was well known to Edward Heath, Lord Hailsham and their colleagues in Brussels. It was the eventual creation of a new European superstate out of 25 existing nations in Europe and Scandinavia, and Britain was going to be part of it. From 1973 onwards, the slow but consistent transfer of power from Westminster to Brussels through successive treaties our own politicians signed became known as the Acquis communautaire. It was nicknamed the Ratchet, for once powers had been given to Brussels by the member state, they could never be returned.
Initially I thought, like everybody else, that we had joined a common market, and what could be nicer and more friendly and sensible and economically wise to do. But since then, in 1975, when we had the vote to remain in that, so we were told, it's become one or two things further than just a common market. It then became, a few years later, a European Economic Community, then a European Community. It's now the European Union, with all sorts of controls and restrictions, regulations, and we're fast approaching, via this new constitution, something that the French have already named potentially a United States of Europe. And I'm not at all sure that that's what I and many others voted to join back in 1975.
Say in 75 we signed up for a social trade agreement, and it's the people who've let the governments, successive governments, gradually vote away our democratic rights. This government has no right to sign us up to the Constitution without the will of the people. But we need the will of the people to stop it. It's no use coming down in 5 years' time, we've signed up to it, we can't get out of it, and the people say, well, we don't want it. It's up to the people of the day to say no.
This is the Strasbourg Parliament. It was built in 1999 at a cost of £300 million. It is open for only 4 days every month. What happens at the end of that 4 days is we load our offices into tin boxes, And then lorries arrive downstairs and drive the whole lot nearly 300 miles up to Brussels, where the boxes are unpacked for the next 3 weeks when we're supposed to be there, and then it's all brought back again. This whole process of shifting the administration and the staff from one home to another is costing the European taxpayer over 100 million euros a year.
It is the biggest scam in human history. We're not talking about billions of pounds, we're talking about trillions of pounds. Why a country which has been independent for 900 or more years would ever wish to involve itself in such political chicanery and nonsense as something which defies anyone who is sane. And only now have we got just about 14 or 15 months before they rivet on us a pan-European constitution which would be superior to our own splendid constitution, one which is the pride of the world and pioneered the way for sensible living. And here we are giving it all away.
The political aim is to develop the framework for a real European Union constitution, and in my opinion this means building up a European federal state.
In black and white, the draft constitution wording confirms Brussels will exercise competence and primacy over member states' own laws. For the British, this will mean being stripped of any remaining independence, losing control over our foreign policy and armed forces, the handing over of our legal system and law enforcement to the European Union, the scrapping of the pound sterling to be replaced by the euro, the handing over of our remaining currency and gold reserves to the European Central Bank, and the total regulation of British domestic and international trade by the European Union. Coincidentally or otherwise, the European goal of dominating Britain, unfinished business going back centuries, will have been accomplished.
Most have already noticed that the job of running Britain is increasingly being carried out in Brussels not by British politicians, but by unaccountable foreign committees most in this country have never even heard of, let alone voted into power. These unelected, inscrutable forums dictate what citizens across the Eurozone can and can't do, down to the last detail. Henceforth, Britain is to be ruled from the new Europe, by the new Europe, and for the benefit of the new Europe. The powers driving this new superstate have always been, indeed as they are today, France and Germany.
When the sun never set on the British Empire, it was run by about 2,000 civil servants. The European Union employs, either as staff or advisors, over 100,000 people. That figure was seriously underestimated until Jens Peter Bonda, who's a Danish MEP, and I persisted in raising questions about the secret committees of the European Union. And we finally got a list of all 3,000, and by deduction we were able to calculate the number of people involved and the number of staff also involved, and that was what took us up to a figure of about 100,000. Now, I just want to talk about the reality of what we are stuck with in Europe at the moment. And I'm going to talk about things which mostly are not discussed and not widely understood, and they should be. The European Union is about control. It is not about enabling things to happen. Some months ago, there was a debate, so-called, in the chamber at Strasbourg. And as you probably know, you get 1 minute if you're lucky. And after that 1 minute, this microphone is switched off, and even if you're still speaking, nobody hears a word. And you only have that 1 minute. You can't intervene when someone else is saying something. You can't intervene after you've spoken because somebody else has said something you want to challenge. It is an elaborate charade, a talking shop. And as a result, very few members turn up for any particular debate. And that was the case on this occasion, and it was a debate, would you believe, about enterprise. Now, I have a background in international business. So I asked for 1 minute, and I got it. And there were about 20 other members in this chamber for over 800. So I was talking to empty chairs mostly. And there was the commissioner responsible for enterprise, a man called Verheugen from Germany. About more later if you want to ask about metrication, by the way. And Verheugen spoke for some 20 minutes, and it was perfectly clear from what he said that he hadn't the first idea of what enterprise, in the sense of wealth creation, is actually all about. There were then a series of other speakers, some of whom had the luxury of 2 minutes, who spoke about social matters, about what is known as the social market, because that's a favourite phrase of the continental Europeans. And most of the speakers were from the socialists, the communists, the Greens and the Liberals. And I think one member of the EPP, not a Tory from the UK, spoke before I did. By the time it came to my turn, I threw away what I was planning to say, because I'd listened to this cataract of platitudinous social nonsense for long enough. And I said this, more or less as I'm going to say it to you. How many people in this chamber today have ever had an idea for a new business, funded it at their own risk by borrowing or raising the money themselves and providing the security for it, expanded it to the point where they can employ other people and run it successfully for 20 years? How many of you have ever done that? You're way ahead of me. Not a single hand went up. And when Mr. Verheugen came to the end of the wind-up of this debate, he made some remarks which were truly breathtaking in their arrogance and indifference. He didn't refer to me directly, but it was aimed at me. And what he in effect was saying, it doesn't matter whether you know about running business, we're here to manage the market of the European Union. That's what mattered to him. Now we come to the argument or the claim that the European Union is about diversity. And in one sense, of course, it is. It includes, what, nearly 600 million people from 27 different countries speaking at least 27, if not more, languages, each country of which, and even bits of those countries, have their own traditions and culture and way of doing things. And this is regarded as a coming together of diversity. And you will hear talk of diversity being a virtue. The reality is entirely the reverse. The reality is that everything is about standardization. And we've seen it with metrication, we've seen it with virtually every aspect of our daily lives that you care to look at. It doesn't matter what it is, the objective is standardization. And the classic example, of course, again, is metrication. What is the purpose of forcing metrication on this country if it isn't to standardise the European Union? There can't be another purpose. They talk about a free trade area. They talk about a common market. Do you remember that rubbish we got in 1975? It is a customs union. It is not a free trade area, and there is a crucial difference between the two. Ask any Australian wine producer and they will tell you instantly what the difference is. The French have freedom to send us as much wine, champagne, whatever, that they want. The Australians have to get quotas to allow their goods to be shipped into this customs union. They have to pay the VAT in advance before it comes in full. They have to account for the sales. They have to prove that the quantities that they've been allocated were actually shipped in and have now been sold inside the European Union. And on and on and on it goes. It is a laborious, tedious, expensive, wasteful process. And it is intended to be just that. It is intended to protect the markets of the countries that are already here in the European Union. That is its purpose. So when I learnt from some very good friends of mine who are wine producers in Australia, and as you will already have worked out, I've got involved in all this. When I found out that the Australian wine producers as a whole had overtaken the French in shipping wine to this country, not the European Union as a whole, and the French were actually losing market share, I have to admit I had a quiet cheer, and we celebrated appropriately. Now I want to come to another aspect which is not widely understood. And my good friend Christopher Booker came up with the best description of it a long while ago when he talked about the hollowing out of our government and departmental processes. And what I mean by that is this. You will, most of you, remember the days when farmers received subsidies, deficiency payments they were called, and it encouraged them to produce enough food to feed this nation in the areas where that was possible. Obviously not bananas and the like, but where we could produce, we did. It also has to be said that this country has the finest wet grassland anywhere in Western Europe. Perfect for the production of meat from cattle and sheep. But what has happened? We have a common agricultural policy which has been damaging our agriculture for years, to the point now where set aside accounts for an area the size of the West Midlands. After foot and mouth some years ago, it became apparent that the European Union was positively against the cattle and sheep industries being fully restored in this country. They have a policy that agriculture belongs in Eastern Europe, and therefore the British should be discouraged by all means possible from producing their own food. Now, if you looked at what was the Ministry of Agriculture today, now called DEFRA, you will not find anybody in that government department with any first-hand knowledge of agricultural subsidies. They've all gone. So even if tomorrow we were out of the European Union, we would be starting again in terms of acquiring the skills and experience to be able to manage and support British farmers. And that's without the fact that thousands of farmers have given up altogether. It's been hollowed out. The same is true of the Board of Trade. We do not have a seat at the World Trade Organization's meetings. We are represented by, God help us, Peter Mandelson, speaking on behalf of all 27 member states. There is nobody in what was the Board of Trade, now the Department of Trade and Industry, so-called. There is nobody there who has any direct experience of negotiating trade deals for this country at a world level. They've gone. We've been hollowed out. The Civil Aviation Authority is the last one I'll mention. I could go on all afternoon about this, but I mention it specifically because one of my constituents was involved. I got a call from a small company near Heathrow Airport some time ago now, a couple of years maybe, and this managing director was beside himself with worry. His company produces specialist in-flight communication systems for the private jet industry. Now you may think that amounts to a handful of small planes that fly off on exotic holidays with wealthy businessmen. Not true. The private jet market is huge, and it's worldwide. And what happens is that let's say a royal family, a Sultan of Brunei, whoever, they will buy a Boeing and they'll buy it as a frame. And the inside is then fitted to their requirements. And the communication system in that Boeing would be provided by a company like the one I'm talking about. And they had just been told that they were having their airworthiness certificate revoked. Just like that. They've been in business for 30 odd years, maybe longer. They employed a large number of staff. They had, he told me then, and I have no doubt he was right, probably the best collection of specialist engineers, designers, airframe installers anywhere in the country, if not in Western Europe. They were a highly specialized, skilled business. And as he said, I've got 60, 70 families depending on me every month, to say nothing of the mortgages and the kids and the whole 9 yards. And what had happened was this. The European Aviation Safety Agency had just come into being in Cologne, and it had taken over the responsibilities of the Civil Aviation Authority in London, as indeed it had taken over the same responsibilities in every other member state. And it had instantaneously decided that all airworthiness certificates, other than those granted to the main builders of airplanes, would be revoked. Just quite arbitrarily and without any thought of the consequences. Now, you can imagine the reaction of this company and probably many others in the UK. I said to him, are you prepared to drop everything and go to Cologne? Yes, he said. I said, right, we're on the next plane tomorrow morning. And that's what we did. He and I got on a plane to Cologne, and we went to this European Aviation Safety Agency. And we sat at the front desk, we banged on the door, and we went in and we demanded to see the chief executive now. And this is the one time when being an MEP is actually quite handy, because they don't say no. They can't say no. Anyway, we got to see him about an hour later, and there was a great team of his staff. There wasn't an Englishman amongst them. The chief exec was a German who didn't speak very good English, so we had an interpreter. He started by boasting that he'd never been to England. which wasn't a very successful way of endearing himself to us. And we explained what had happened, and we demanded an explanation. And furthermore, I told him that we needed an explanation within the next 24 hours, and we were going to wait for it. And I reserved my position on whether I went public until he had an opportunity to sort this mess out. And he pleaded that he didn't understand, he didn't realise, nobody told him in London what the consequences would be, you know, always it's the other guy's fault. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, we got the decision revoked.
Well done. Well done.
It didn't take them long. Christopher Booker ran a piece about it a week or so later, and that company is still in business today, I'm happy to say. But the point really is this hollowing out. The Civil Aviation Authority had lost its powers to make decisions of that kind. The Civil Aviation Authority at one time was regarded as a world leader in terms of the way it managed civil aviation in this country. They were held up as an example because we have probably more, in fact Heathrow on its own is the biggest international hub in the world. It has more international flights coming in and going out than any other airport anywhere. So to have the organisation which was supposed to be responsible for the overall safety systems and the security and so on, suddenly losing its powers and having them handed over to some obscure organisation in Cologne, who clearly hadn't the faintest idea about the consequences of what they were doing, is quite totally unacceptable in my book. Right, so that's enough for starters. Let me now go on briefly to the secret committees, which I mentioned earlier. 3,000 of them. We don't know who sits on them, except that no MEPs, nobody elected to the Parliament has a seat on any of these secret committees. They are all nominated officials, experts, consultants, you name it. They come from the academic world, from the government, the civil servants, from around the European Union and so on. But we as elected members of the Parliament are not allowed to sit on these committees. We don't know what their agendas are. We don't know what their budgets are. We don't know when they meet or how often. We don't know what their decisions are. And most importantly of all, we cannot get rid of them. They are there entirely to advise the Commission on what next it should do in terms of introducing new legislation. In other words, it is well, I think the word ratchet has been used before. It's a sort of vernacular railway. It's only going in one direction. Now let me come briefly to the question of money. You all know we give them £1.5 million an hour, in return for which we have something like 170,000 pages of legislation, every page of which we could do perfectly well without before we joined. And it's difficult to see an answer, and I've never ever been able to get one on either side of the English Channel to the question, what are the benefits of this? We all know the sort of generalities that are used, like isolation, influence, which is, I have to be polite here, cobblers. But let me come to the money. Did you know that there are 662 bank accounts in the name of the European Union in 45 countries around the world? Did you know that of those accounts, there are some 30,000 subsidiary, what are known as pre-financing or imprest accounts, into which money is put to pay for projects that have been approved. And of course, once the money goes into an imprest account, they lose control of it because the new signatories on that account are the people who are handling the project. And that's where some of the corruption kicks in, which I'll talk about later. Only 1% of those accounts have ever been fully audited. And they have been audited by the Court of Auditors, which is itself an institution of the European Union. It claims to be independent, but it isn't. Each member state nominates a member for the Court of Auditors. Some of them are accountants, some of them are academics. I think a couple of them have some experience of the business world. One of them I know is a journalist, and they have no professional integrity as financial auditors as such. And I'll just give you a couple of illustrations of the consequences of that inadequacy. I'm advised by Christopher Arkell, amongst several others, and some of you may know that Christopher is one of the UK's leading forensic accountants. And he's a brilliant accountant, and he's also a very, very sharp cookie. He's passionately on our side in terms of believing we should not be part of this lunatic asylum, and he has been an enormous value to me in getting to grips with what is actually being done with your money. And one of the things he discovered was that the pension funds for the European Commission were appearing on both sides of the balance sheet simultaneously. They were being shown as a liability to the member states, but they were also being shown as an asset of the European Union, together with the money which the member states had already paid towards those pensions, because it comes out of the bigger pot of our general contribution. So in other words, there was double counting going on. And it amounted to some £300 million when we discovered it, or he did. I would never have discovered it in a month of Sundays, but he did. So I asked an innocent question. Is this a liability or is it an asset? Why does it appear in effect twice on one side of the balance sheet and only once on the other? Well, there was a lot of mumbling and technical jargon coming from the accounts department and the chief accountant in particular, a man called Gray, who is an Englishman, and grey by nature as well. And I have to tell you, and I can't explain the logic, Christopher might be able to, just take my word for it. This year, suddenly, in the 2005 accounts, sorry, 2006 accounts, suddenly the pension balance on the pension allocations on the balance sheet have been changed. Now, okay, it's only a small point, maybe it won't affect any of us, but it's a reflection of how they will, if they can, get away with anything. And we caught them at it, and they've now regularized the position. Let me give you another illustration of what we have to endure. Coming back to these imprest accounts. Let's suppose there's a project in, for argument's sake, Hungary, and it involves 200 million euros on an infrastructure scheme, bridges, roads, whatever. If that money is not properly spent and not properly accounted for, or some of it goes missing, you would expect the auditors to come down on it like a ton of bricks. And you would expect them to go to, for example, what is known as OLAF, which is the organisation responsible for investigating alleged fraud. And OLAF, in all the time it's existed, has never ever successfully brought a prosecution and recovered the money on any single case it's investigated. Not one. But the point of this story is this. After 5 years of investigation, that lost money or unaccounted for money is written off automatically. It's just regarded as gone. There is no further attempt made to account for it or recover it or to pursue the people who appear to have been involved in its mismanagement. It is automatically written off. And that's our money we're talking about. Something else that Christopher Arkell discovered, and that is that the opening and closing balances in the years 04 and 05 were never reconciled. Now, I better explain that. In 05, the European Union boasted, you may recall, that it was introducing a new system of automatic computer-based accounting based on double entry bookkeeping. 2005. I might incidentally just add that double entry bookkeeping was invented 1500 years ago by an Italian monk. But eventually the EU caught up in 2005. But it meant that the books had to be closed and all the closing balances reconciled at the end of 04 and then transferred to become the opening balances for 05. And we got some very compromised claims that such balances had in fact been reconciled. And superficially the numbers appeared to make sense. Back to Christopher Arkell, here are the sets of numbers, he ran an analysis, and would you believe they did not actually reconcile at all. And I've been on this with his help ever since the 05 accounts came into the public domain, and we finally got them to admit, only in March of this year, over a year later, they have now finally admitted that the opening balances for 05 were never reconciled with the previous year. Now what that also means is that there can never be an approval of future accounts. Because if you don't know where you're starting from, how can you possibly say what the position is today? It's impossible. So the Court of Auditors is now stuck with the problem, and this is why they didn't want to admit it. They're now stuck with the problem that they will never be able to sign off the EU's accounts as being a true and correct record, because the opening figures are in dispute. People ask me sometimes, why does the EU not carry out cost-benefit analyses? Wouldn't that be more sensible? Good question. So I asked it. Several times I asked it. And I kept getting all kinds of obscure, it's too difficult, very complicated, and so on and so on. And eventually, one of their minions finally came up with the unanswerable answer. And I tell you exactly, these were the words. We can't do a cost-benefit analysis on any of the things we introduce or decide should become law, what called law in the EU. We can't do a cost-benefit analysis because the benefits will be different in each country. And furthermore, the costs of enforcement might be different in each country. So it's quite impossible. Oh, it's a superb answer. They must have spent weeks figuring that out. And months. Well, okay. Now let me come back to this business about, well, an extension of what I'm just saying. The European Union uses a device which it calls shared management. Now again, it's probably not a phrase many of you have heard before, but you should have known. It should be widely known. But it's one of these obscure things which gets ignored by and large. And it's really an extension of what I've just been saying about cost-benefit. The view is that we, the EU Commission, decide what the law shall be, but you, the member states, are responsible for enforcing it. And that's your problem. We don't want to know about that. We don't want to know if it's inconvenient or costly or damages people's lives. No, we're just providing the law. You have the responsibility for enforcement. And that is what is laughingly described as shared management. We decide, you suffer the consequences. And it is appalling. I've had a case, some of you will know of Idris Francis, who's a very good friend of mine, and apart from being a passionate campaigner for our cause, is also a veteran car nut. And he's got a half a dozen beautiful old cars which he restores himself. Now, the particular kind of paint required to restore a vintage car is cellulose based, I'm told. And suddenly last year the EU introduced legislation banning the use of cellulose in paint without regard for the consequences for this highly specialised market, which tends to be particularly British. You don't find vintage cars in many other European countries, but you do here. I have been on for over a year on his behalf asking questions about how it is the vintage car market in this country has been damaged, and without any regard for its interests, and let alone the vintage car owners. We're also talking about the specialist paint shops that employ people, and they have mortgages and lifestyles and kids at school and all the rest. We come back to what I was saying earlier about aircraft communication systems. Same situation exactly. These small companies have been put out of business simply to standardize the market. And then we come to a whole raft of mischief. Greek farmers claim subsidies or common agricultural payments on more land than there is in Greece. The total number of acres, sorry, hectares as they call them, claimed for Greek production of olives and tobacco is greater than the landmass of Greece itself. And of course, under shared management, does the Greek government care? Do they go out and have an army of investigators checking? Of course they don't. It's in the interests of Greek farmers. So they let them get away with it. And who's paying? We are. Italian butter. Oh, what a scam that was. And it's possibly still going on. The EU said, if you export butter from one EU member state to another, we will give you a special subsidy. Now the Italians took this to heart. They started producing butter with engine oil, cedar oil, any oil they could get hold of that looked vaguely or could be made to look vaguely like butter. There were no checks on the content, quality or edibility, to say nothing of health and safety, and they shipped this butter all over the European Union. This was before enlargement, so we're talking about Spain, Scandinavia, Austria, Germany, whatever. And once it went across the border, they then claimed the subsidy. Now, it was such an outrageous scam and the quality of the butter was so dreadful that it wasn't long before the whole thing came to light. But to this day, nobody has been charged. Olaf has not recovered a single euro's worth of the money that was paid out in subsidies to these Italians. There has not been any prosecution, and the whole thing has been in effect now, years later, swept under the carpet because it is too embarrassing. And I raised this in my early days in Brussels. I sit on what is known as the Budget Control Committee, and we are particularly charged with ensuring the proper use of public money. Quite right too. And I raised